Hi, Miss Butt here with today's chapter. I'd like you to pause the video and tell anyone that would listen what's happened so far in the book. Also, we're also helping Alva with her investigation. I can see a rune here, and I hope you have taken notes. Right, so let's start with chapter 3. Then there were none. Alva's mouth was watering. Ivan shoveled another hunk of bread into his hot little face, staring at her while he chewed and dribbled. Her stomach groaned. The punishment for her late-night adventure was a lengthy tongue-lashing from her mother and no breakfast. She was also meant to stay within the hut for 5 days and nights, but Magnus had returned in the early hours of the morning and said he would need her to assist him. A small mercy, but one that had set her mother glowering around the kitchen like a newly sparked fire. Ivan licked his lips and ran off to pester Brianna as her uncle strode menacingly towards the table. Despite having saved her from part of her punishment, Magnus was not in a kind mood, and when he sat down next to Alva on the bench, it rattled as he drew it towards the table, and Alva shrank smaller so as to avoid his glare. "You did a very foolish thing last night, girl. I presume you followed me to the hall when the Jarl's men arrived. If so, you must have heard the alarming saga spun by the monk, Edmund of Lindisfarne." "Yes, I'm sorry, Uncle, but what a thrilling tale." Her uncle interrupted angrily. "In that case, you know that a man was taken by force in the night. And of all nights, you chose that one to go adventuring in the mountains. You are a reckless girl and wild child. By the gods, you still have the branches of the mountain tangled in your hair. You will need to be far more presentable if we are to visit Meganslaw." Alva sat up with excitement. "I'm going to the Jarl's Hall?" "This is not a prize, girl," her uncle snapped. "You will need to come with me and show him that object you have in your pouch. But first, you must show it to me." She could feel her cheeks glowing red. "I would have shown it to you sooner, but with the Jarl's men around," her voice trailed off as she brought the bone fragment out of the knot of yarn, pebbles, leaves, and buttons congealed at the bottom of her pouch. When her mother had finally stopped shouting at Alva in the early hours and let her go to bed, she had taken out the object to wipe the dirt from it. It was still mucky, but the rows of repeating runes were now much clearer on the surface. "Do you know what this is?" Magnus said to her, taking a piece of bone from her hands. "Yes, Uncle," she replied. "I heard the stranger tell of the casket with clues that would lead to an incredible treasure. I guess this is part of the box." He didn't reply, but turned his eyes towards the lines of the runes that were etched skillfully on the fragment in his hands. His face was pale. Suddenly he leapt from his seat. Alva craned her neck to see what had given her uncle such a shock. What could have upset him so much? "Brianna!" he called anxiously. Her mother dropped her ladle with a clatter into the large pot she was stirring on the fire. "What is it?" she said brusquely. "The broth is boiling over." "Come here," he replied. "You'll have to wait," said her mother, wiping her hands on her apron. After a raging tirade first thing, when she and Magnus had argued over Alva being allowed out of the house, she had hardly spoken a word to either of them since rising. Instead, she was purposely ignoring them, cooking, cajoling Ivan, and noisily bustling around the hearth at the other end of the hut. Alva was now fixated on the white fragment on the table in front of her, which was lying brightly in the shaft of sunlight that glanced through the open shutters. "If your mother doesn't want to know, then so be it," Magnus said, lowering his voice. "We'll work quietly on this together, a secret mission, just you and me. Look at these runes." "Alva, do you see anything?" Her uncle's eyes were wide and he looked worried. "What do you think these runes could be?" Why is the uncle so worried? Let's find out. Magnus edged closer to her and took her by a hand. He placed a finger on top of a single rune. She could feel his palms were clammy. Suddenly, her sense of excitement was replaced with one of fear. "What letter is that, Alva?" he asked. "It looks to me like Fihu," she replied. But then she saw the symbol next to it, a small triangle shape. Alva knew these two signs very well. Her father had scratched them over and over for her. "By Freya, that's my name!" "Now look here," said her uncle. He pointed to another rune. "It's Manaz, the rule for man," said Alva. "Yes, but look at the rune next to it," Magnus replied. "There was a circle with a line through it, next to the man rune. This was your father's way of referring to me. As young boys, we talked of being two halves of a whole, one man in two parts." And here, he said, lowering his voice so he couldn't be heard above Ivan's happy shrieks, and Brianna clattering around, he pointed to the rune Othalan, the rune for home. Alva asked, beside it was another strange symbol, an apple. Magnus placed his finger over that. This is a symbol of Iduna, the goddess of eternal spring, who alone could pick the sacred apples and provide an endless feast for the gods. Your father said your mother was a goddess of his home, so this is how he wrote her name. Alva's mind began to replay a long-forgotten memory, her father chasing her mother around the hut, the two of them laughing with a half-eaten apple. Her heart ached for a moment. They sat in silence looking at the repeating patterns of their names, etched one after another in the lines across the bone fragment. These are our runes. This is from Father, Alva said slowly. Magnus looked at her and nodded. It seems so. We must tell Mother. They looked towards the hearth where Brianna was angrily scrubbing Ivan. He had soiled himself, and there was mess everywhere. The news of this casket has something to do with your father. Will upset her, said Magnus. She doesn't know yet all the details about our investigations in the forest, and we still have more to discover. I think we should keep this to ourselves for a little longer while we investigate. Now we know that Björn is somehow involved in this, the mystery gets more unsettling at every step. I think we need to speak with the man who found the casket. Perhaps he has news of Björn's whereabouts. It's been nearly a year, Alva replied sadly. It's too much to hope that my father will return to Kilsgard. And yet, Magnus answered, here he speaks directly to us. The monk must know something. Jarl Erik gave him safe haven last night, so perhaps he can tell us where he got the casket. He may even recall some other runes. He grabbed his cloak and looked over at Alva. Well, come on, he said. We have to pick up the bramble out your shabby hair as we go. By the gods, you need to take more care, girl. You could bathe occasionally. He strode out of the room and Alva scuttled quickly behind. They could hear Brianna shouting angrily at the door as it closed off, her cries. The outline of Meginslaw glowed in the bright, wintry sunlight. Kilsgard was coming to life after a fretful night, but the daily sounds of sweeping floors, lowing cattle, and busy wagons were slowly filling the air. Alva felt a thrill of excitement rush through her. Magnus was including her in this investigation for the first time. He had a slight spring in his step as she approached the Jarl's hall. Above the gable of the wide oak doors was a carved figure, Jormungand, the world serpent, writhing across the upper beams and biting onto his tail. While he held tight, the world would continue. If he let go, the chaos of Ragnarok, the end of the world, would begin. Alva had passed through these doors a number of times in her life. Once she was allowed to watch her uncle give testimony in front of the Jarl for the life of a man caught stealing. Uncle Magnus was often called upon the Jarl Erik for his wisdom and careful assessment of crimes. But Alva was awed by the massive space every time she walked into Meginslaw's lofty vaulted hall. The roof was 4 times as high as that of her own hut, and around the sides benches were covered with lash furs and woolen blankets. At the center of the hearth fire and standing there, warming his hands, was the Jarl. Not as tall as her uncle, the Jarl was broader and wider than Magnus. As a young man, he had been a fierce warrior, but too many roast pigs and too much meat had shrunken him, giving him a soft stomach that stuck out of his leather belt. 2 round, red cheeks perched above his full brown beard, and twinkling eyes peered out through a mass of dark braided hair. He did not scare Alva. Magnus? Erik bellowed from the fireplace, his beard juddering, and youngling Alva too. What a night it has been. None of us has slept well in the hall. The thought of a criminal roaming giant's finger has sent the fire of vengeance burning in the heart of many of the men here. They want to find this villain and punish him. Have you discovered any more since we spoke? Magnus shook off his cloak and walked over. Yes, Jarl Erik, he replied, handing over the fragment of casket. I'm so sorry I didn't bring this to your attention last night, but my niece here did something very disobedient. Don't worry, she'd been sorely reprimanded, and she went ahead of me to the site where the man was taken and found this. That was a reckless thing to do, Alva, said the Jarl. He was so like your father. We could never keep him from wandering alone in the mountains either, could we, Magnus? Chuckling, he clapped a huge weather-worn hand on Magnus's shoulder. So, you found this, Alva? Her cheeks burnt red with a mix of pride and embarrassment. She mumbled towards her shoes, I did. But what is this? Eric looked down at the piece of bone, turning it over to explore its surfaces in the flickering firelight. The casket, he inquired of Magnus. Here are the runes. For some I know, some I do not. But it's part of the casket. I think it's the lid, Magnus replied. It must have come loose as the warrior was dragged away in the night. It fell into the mud, and Alva here found it. She only showed it to me for the first time this morning, and I came straight to you. We cannot decide the runes yet. He glanced down to the floor as he said this. Alva knew this meant he was lying, which of course he was. It seems to be encrypted, her uncle continued, and this is only part of the message. We need to know what else was written on this strange box. Naturally, we'll need to speak to the monk. Naturally, Eric replied. We put him to rest in the outhouse. He was exhausted from his ordeal and did not trust to sleep in here. With all the cows, I don't blame him. We have not seen him yet this morning. Go wake him and tell him he can eat in here with us, if he would like. We're having mutton stew. Eric slapped his chops enthusiastically at the thought. Alva followed Uncle Magnus through the hall to the rear hall, which backed onto a yard. Around the periphery was a cluster of small wooden huts. Some were used to house workmen or servants, while others contained beasts. Magnus saw the door of the central hut was still closed, so walked towards it. After banging his fist against the side, he pushed the door open and they walked in. The space was empty. Uncle, Alva said, pointing nervously at the door. The hay that the monk had been used as a bed was disturbed. It looked like someone was struggling here, she whispered anxiously. Magnus bent down and looked closely to the ground. The hay was churned up in mounds, and there was a red stain of blood scattered in drops across the floorboards. The air turned still as both held their breath. This is very serious, Alva. I don't think the monk left here willingly. I think he, like the English warrior, had been removed by force. We must tell Eric. His household will be under suspicion now, as Edmund of Lindensfarne had been seized from his property when he was promised safety. But Alva was distracted. She had noticed something on the back wall of the hut. Look here, she said, striding over to the floor. Alva, Magnus shrieked, you're walking straight through the evidence. But then he saw what she was pointing at. Runes were carved into wooden panels of the back wall. By Thor, he murmured, you are becoming quite the investigator, Alva. Drawing closer, he pulled a strange circular glass from his leather pouch. He also drew out his writing tablet and stylus. There must be missing runes, Alva said excitedly. Looking over her shoulder, she could see that her uncle was already scribbling small versions of symbols on his waxboard. But they can't be complete, can they? She continued. Surely the monk would have known all the runes. He must have been carving these from memory. I wonder if we can trust them. Stand back, girl, Magnus grumbled at her. You're blocking the light. Give me some time to get them down. Why don't you look around the floor, see if we've missed anything? Alva walked across the small space, casting her eyes over the hay. To the left of the wall were wooden shelves, full of farming implements, buckets and building materials. Cobwebs and dust covered most of the items. But tucked next to a rusty knife was a small bag. It was not dusty. Alva took it down. It was battered. Old leather pouch. Lifting the flap, she felt inside. Drawing out something brittle. Uncle, what's this? She called across the room. She held the contents of the bag up in the light. Where did you find that? Magnus asked, taking the scroll from his hand. You know what this is, Alva? It's parchment, animal skin. Monks use it to write down their sacred texts and anything else they want to be remembered beyond their lifetime. He unfurled the thin roll, and Alva saw symbols scribbled over the surface. She knew what this was, Latin, the language of Christians used. They did not scratch their letters onto stone or leather or bone. They wrote onto the skin of sheep, which had been scraped thin and tied together within leather covers. Many Vikings did not understand the importance of these books, but Alva's father and uncle had shown her some and taught her to respect them. They held the knowledge of ages and the stories of people from all over the world. Bjorn, in particular, used to tell her many fantastical tales he had read in books while on his travels, in which brave knights romanced beautiful princesses. He sought hidden treasure on great quests. Amidst the scribbles of backgall ink in front of her now, Alva could see there was a diagram, a green shape with blue edging, and individual small buildings painted across it. What does this show? She asked, pointing at the picture. I think it's a map, Magnus replied. Do you mean it's a picture of land? Alva asked quizzically. Yes, they're extremely rare, but in some parts of the world, travellers have plotted their journeys as a picture to show the limit of kingdoms, the coastlines, and the pathways to town. He looked more closely. As he read the word written in larger script above the particular structure, he took a step back. Well, well, this is a map showing the route of Edmund's monastery of Lindisfarne to the great city of Constantinople. This is an extraordinary thing for a monk to own. Why would he have this in his possession? Alva took the parchment from Uncle Magnus and looked at it carefully. The blue areas must be sea, she figured, and the green area's land. What a thing, she said, mystified. Imagine if our men had guidance when we went to Viking. You would be able to navigate the waters like a seagull looking down from above. Do you think the monk has travelled this long route? When he mentioned being on a long journey with his companion, perhaps it was his way to Constantinople when he encountered Bjorn. Your father was set for that golden place, looking to secure wealth through trading along the route. Alva, this gets clearer and yet more opaque with every moment. I fear this is only the start of the saga. So, that was chapter 3. Any words that you weren't quite sure about, I hope you've written them down and looked up in the dictionary for what they mean. What I'd like you to do with the words that you weren't quite sure about, can you make those words into sentences? And I will see you tomorrow with chapter 4.